Although the northern states had won the war, it was by no means clear what that was going to mean for the political condition within the states. After all, under the 13th Amendment, it declared that slavery would no longer be legal within the states. But other than that, the constitutional boundaries were still in place, which is to say that states were entirely sovereign within their own borders, except for those few powers that had been given to the federal government. And that being the case, the southern states could treat the former slaves as they saw fit. And once this military occupation was at an end, it was a real open question as to whether or not these former slaves were going to be treated legally in very much the same condition as slaves always had, but just perhaps by a different name.
The 13th Amendment kind of formalizes what had begun to happen during the war of just ending slavery legally. Remember, the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to places that were in rebellion where the Union Army arrives. Didn't apply to the border states that stayed in the Union, Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, so there's thousands of slaves there. During the war, Lincoln begins to press them to gradually end slavery. But ultimately, the 13th Amendment is going to permanently end slavery throughout the entire Union and make it so that no state can ever re-legalize it in the future. And of course, the northern states, there is some debate over this, but the vast majority of them embrace this. Most of the southern states only accept this because they had already been defeated in war, and this is a requirement for being readmitted into the Union, is that you have to ratify the 13th Amendment.
The 14th Amendment was deemed necessary in order to prevent the southern states from essentially treating their former enslaved population as slaves in condition, if not by law. And therefore, it was recognized that certain rights were going to have to be protected. And the 14th Amendment sets forth what are really only the bare bones. First of all, it is going to reverse the Dred Scott decision by stating very plainly what a citizen of the United States and a citizen of these states actually is. And therefore, anyone who is born in the United States is a citizen of the United States and the state in which he resides. And the southern states are no longer going to legally be able to deny citizenship to anyone who was born within the United States. But in addition to that, they sought certain protections in the law. That, first of all, citizens would be guaranteed the same privileges and immunities of all other citizens, no matter which state they were in. And second of all, mirroring the Fifth Amendment, which was a prohibition on the federal government from taking the life, liberty, or property of any person without due process of law. What the 14th Amendment did is it took that principle and applied it not to the federal government, but to each state government. And this was one of the most severe limitations to state power that had ever been included in the Constitution.
Another important part of the 14th Amendment is the doctrine of incorporation, and this transfers some powers from the state governments to the federal government. So the fear is that the southern state governments will limit the rights of the former slaves there, but this now allows the federal government to defend the rights of its citizens against what the states might do. So it gives more power to the federal government to protect citizens from their own state governments. And this can really expands federal powers into all sorts of areas, but it's initially intended to protect free Black Americans in the South.
The 14th Amendment had defined what a citizen of the United States was, and it had merely touched on the question of suffrage. It had said that any state that denied the vote to males 21 and over for any reason other than being a felon, that they would be punished by having less representation in Congress. But nonetheless, it was still legal for a state to deny suffrage to those who had been former slaves. And therefore, the 15th Amendment was passed in order to correct that omission, because it had become very clear that this mild punitive action that you had in the 14th Amendment was not going to be sufficient to goad the states into allowing suffrage rights for those who had formerly been slaves.
The next of the important Civil War and Reconstruction amendments is the 15th Amendment, and this establishes black suffrage by explicitly saying that suffrage, the right to vote, cannot be limited based on racial restrictions or other restrictions designed to target people based on their race. And again, the intention of this is to protect the rights of black Southerners to vote, and also remember that in most of the North, black Americans had also been denied suffrage over the course of the first half of the 19th century. And so this restores black suffrage throughout the nation and is intended to prevent the states, in conjunction with the 14th Amendment, it's intended to prevent the states from ever trying to restrict suffrage based on race. Unfortunately, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are not as successful at protecting the rights of former slaves as people had hoped, because they're really dependent on force. The white Southerners do not like these for the most part. And so during the early years of Reconstruction, when the war ends and there's still the Union Army presence in the South, they're able to enforce these new amendments and these laws that go along with them. But after 1877, when the North basically pulls out of the South, Reconstruction effectively ends, then you have vigilante violence in the form of the Ku Klux Klan and similar groups. They'd been fighting against the Union troops the whole time, but now they really just take over and through kind of terror campaigns prevent African Americans from voting, and they pass all sorts of new laws that are designed to effectively disenfranchise blacks without explicitly saying so. So passing things like the literacy tests, where of course people that had been raised as slaves and hadn't been allowed to learn how to vote or to read, they're not now allowed to vote. And so effectively the South is able to kind of undermine the goals of the 14th and 15th Amendments.